God is a God who doesn't make sense sometimes, right? Like he's God and we're not. And so that gives us that opportunity to look at him and say, okay, we're not in control here. He is.
What is up, my crew? This is the Nook Podcast. My name is Stephen Murphy, and I really appreciate you taking some time to listen today. You just heard a clip from my guest, Jason Romano. He is an author, speaker, and the director of media for Sports Spectrum, a media company that specializes in sports news, but more specifically, athletes and others who are Christ followers. Jason spent 17 years as a producer with ESPN, a job that he never thought he could even have. So why would he ever consider leaving? Well, that's just a little of what you're going to hear about today. So settle in for my conversation with Jason Romano. I think the easy place to jump in is that you and I share the element of having spent a lot of time in sports television. Could you give me a little bit of the background on how you got started at, just in sports general? Because I maybe I know too much from my research, but where did you get into the whole sports side of things in the first place?
Well, it starts with the fandom when I was a kid, obviously, and just loved sports. I tell people sports was all I cared about. It was my God. It was what I was consumed with. It's really all I cared about, to be quite honest. And so from that, kind of grew and bloomed into a desire to go into sports broadcasting. I love playing sports too, but I realized probably around 14, 15 that whole college and professional sports thing, as much as I would have loved it to happen, it just wasn't going to happen. So I said, what's the next best thing? Well, I could talk about sports. I could work in sports. And so I had this desire when I started choosing colleges was to look for colleges that had good broadcasting programs so I could learn about broadcasting and potentially get a job in the field. When I got out of college, and I have my own radio show and did television and lots of writing in college. So I enjoyed the sports side of things in college, but I wasn't getting paid for it yet. It was just for fun. But when I got out of college, I got a job in local radio working at WGY in Albany, New York, which is a news talk station. And there wasn't a whole lot of sports, but I still loved my job. I was in radio. I was just so happy to be paid, although it wasn't a lot, but to be happy to be paid working in broadcasting. And I loved it. I did that for 3 years, but then the opportunity to leave to go to ESPN came along. And I didn't think ESPN would ever come along. I tell people my dream was not to work at ESPN because I just thought it wasn't possible. I thought, this little kid from this small town is not going to be able to work at a place like ESPN. So maybe I could be the sports TV anchor for the local Channel 13 newscast, in Albany, New York. That was kind of the dream. If I thought, what kind of job could I do that would be amazing? And then I ended up at ESPN as a producer, and I stayed there for a long time, 17 years, and I loved it. I really did. Get to talk sports every single day. What beats that? It was pretty awesome.
It was something you're going to be talking about anyway, right?
That's it. If you want to pay me, enough money to make a living and support my wife and my daughter while we're at it, sure, let's go. But I would have done that anyways. That's for sure. Yeah. I probably would have done that job even on a part-time level for free, just because it was ESPN. But the fact that I was able to turn it into a career was really a blessing.
So I can only imagine that you're having that pinch me moment your first day, your first week. Did it maintain that level of, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm doing this for the whole time? Or did that start to wane?
It's a great question because I tell people this. It really didn't wane. I think there are moments where you kind of settle into your job, but for the most part, I really would come home and tell my wife, I can't believe I talked to this person today, or I can't believe we got to, do a show about this, or even just the fun stuff that we got to do on shows like Mike and Mike and shows like First Take, where we were eating hot dogs outside in at ESPN's gym and court outside of the cafeteria and being filmed for it because, it was part of a hot dog eating contest promotion with that ESPN carries for the July 4th show. Yep. I mean, it was things like that I was like, oh, I'm getting paid.
This is your job
to do this. What is going on? I do remember though, the very first day I walked in, it was legit, butterflies, and I cannot believe I get to work here. I also remember my last day on February 10th, 2017, and thinking, I cannot believe I got to work at this place for 17 years. So I didn't lose the appreciation of it much. I mean, there are highs and lows in every job where you're kind of like, man, I wish this boss was a little bit nicer to me, or I wish this opportunity was a little bit, clear or whatever. But I mean, I got to do things that I never even thought about or dreamed about because I worked at ESPN during my time there. And even now post ESPN, I'm doing things today that I could not have dreamed about. And a lot of it, if not all of it, goes to the fact that I got to work for those 4 letters for so many years. Yeah,
I'm sure that opens the door for all kinds of stuff.
Oh my gosh. I mean, not just in meeting people in your job at ESPN, which that's what it did. And it created relationships with people in the world of sports. If you told me when I was 12 years old, I'm going to become friends with my baseball sports hero, I would have laughed at you. Said, no way, you're nuts. That's insane. I would have just been happy if you told me maybe someday I would meet that person, much less become friends with him. And that happened to me with Darryl Strawberry. And so that only happens because of ESPN, right? And now you mentioned about doors afterwards. Well, that's where the crazy part kind of this whole journey really takes shape, because when I left, I went to work for Sports Spectrum, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that, and write a couple of books. And my desire was never to work in certainly a ministry capacity. It was certainly never to write books, but I wrote my first book, and Darryl Strawberry wrote the foreword to it.
Oh, nice.
So what's happening, right? It's just kind of a crazy journey that I look at now and I just shake my head at.
Well, and maybe that's a good place to pivot, because one of my favorite parts of your story was I'd call it a chance encounter, but it was a part of your job, was a day that Tony Dungy was at the studio and you got to hang out with him. Give my listeners a little bit of an insight what that looked like.
Job that I was working at that time was a talent producer. So I'm a booker, producer. If you're in the business, you know there are bookers who are the ones that secure the guests for all the different shows. And most network level shows have these bookers that work. And so we call them talent producers, but it's just a fancy name for a booker. Right. And my job at that time was not only to book guests for the shows that would, these guests might be on the phone or be remote from a studio or whatever. But every so often we would book guests that would come to the ESPN studios. We called it the ESPN car wash. So you would book the guest.
I love that
It wasn't
term.
a car wash. It was great though. I mean, Bob Lee, actually, I shouldn't say I don't know. Bob Lee is the one who invented this name, because he said, when you come to ESPN and you're sort of flooded with going from show to show to show to show, it feels like you're getting the works thrown at you. And thus the name Car Wash was born. And so Tony Dungy, that August day in 2000, I think it was 2010, I find out that Coach Dungy has a new book out, and I'm talking to his publicists, and they mentioned the idea of coming up to Bristol, Connecticut, because they were going to be in the New York City area. It's just a couple hours drive. And I said, yeah, come on up. I'll put together a schedule of shows that you can appear on, and it'll be a great day. And we had about 9 or 10 different platforms at ESPN that Coach Dungy did interviews on. So it was quite the full day for him. And I knew that Coach Dungy is a believer, a follower of Christ. And I got really excited about that aspect as a person of faith myself. So I knew, hey, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some things that aren't just football related or broadcasting related or whatever. And it happened, but it happened in a way that I just wasn't expecting. So apparently Coach Dungy's publicist and assistant, because we had a relationship previously on some other guests that we had booked, they knew that I was a Christian. I think we might've been friends on Facebook or something. And so they saw that I go to church or that I tweet out a Bible verse or whatever. And so Coach Dungy goes on Mike and Mike, his first show, and then he finishes the show And we end up in our little green room, which is just a kind of a side room area that we're hanging out in, waiting for the next show to start. And coach has maybe 15 minutes. And, he did not have to do this. He could have, he could have asked me questions about ESPN, or he could have started talking about anything else. But he took just a moment to say, Jason, tell me about you. Who are you? I understand you're a follower of Christ. So we were talking for a few minutes. And then he asked the question, Steve, that changes my life forever. And I tell people that because it made me think in a different way about how I approached my job.
Yeah.
He said, Jason, how do you live your faith out in the workplace here at ESPN? And I thought, that's a really interesting question. And my response, as I thought about it, and then I said it, was not one that he liked. You could kind of see him shaking his head when I responded. Because I said, Coach, I don't even know if that's possible. I said, I love the Lord. I love being a Christian. But how am I supposed to live my faith out at ESPN? I need to go work for a church, or work for a ministry, or work for a place like Fellowship of Christian Athletes or Sports Spectrum or something like that to live my faith out in my job. And he looked at me and he was about to say something. He's kind of down and shaking his head a little bit. But his assistant, Jessica, jumps in front of him and looks at me and says, you don't get it, do you? And she puts her hands on her hips and is kind of this stern mom. And Jessica and I had known each other. So I think she felt like she had permission to be as bold as she was.
Sure.
And she said, I don't think you get it, Jason. Look where you work. And I was kind of like, okay, keep talking here. And she goes, you're a Christian at ESPN. What an amazing place for you to be a light to those in the darkness. What an amazing place. What an amazing ministry that you have here at ESPN. 4,000, 5,000 people on campus that you can potentially be Jesus to in some ways, reflecting the glory of who he is. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was like a light bulb went off above my head. And I said, I get it now. I get it. And she made such a great point. She said, until God calls you away somewhere else, which he may, you're to bloom where you're planted. And that ended up being the title. The second chapter of my book of Uniform of Leadership is called Bloom Where You're Planted. I actually wanted it to be the title of the whole book, but when publishers get involved, we got to come to a mutual agreement here. But Bloom Where You're Planted has been sort of this moniker for me for so many years now, but it helped me realize that I was, for so many years, an ESPN producer who happened to be a Christian, a husband and a dad who happened to be a Christian. And I had it backwards. What I really needed to get, and Jessica and Coach Dungy, in asking that question, changed my focus and made me realize that, no, I'm a Christian first. I'm a follower of Christ wherever I go, and everything else flows from that.
Yeah.
So I'm a Christian who happens to work at ESPN. I'm a Christian who happens to be a dad, who happens to be a husband, who happens to be a sports fan.
Yep.
I'm a Christian first, and it's the center of my life, and everything flows from that. And so when I got that, when that light bulb went off and Jessica and Tony said that, it really helped me understand how to go back to work the next day, or maybe it was a while after that. I don't remember exactly when it was, but to go back to work and understand that this was my mission field today. And so for this day, how can I be the hands and feet of Jesus to someone else? And a lot of that came down to me serving them, because I can't preach the gospel at work with, bringing the Bible into the office as I'm getting ready for a show and reading from the book of Luke, to my producers and my colleagues. Like, I would probably have gotten fired if I did that.
Sure.
Because that's not why I was hired. I was hired to be a producer. But there were a lot of ways that I could show them the love of Christ in how I did my job, how I treated them, how I served them. And that really, like I said, it changed the way I approached anything in life, but certainly the way I approached my job at ESPN.
Well, that makes me curious then. At what point did faith in Christ enter the Jason Romano story?
It was 2001. Ironically, about 20 years ago from the time that we're recording this, that God got a hold of my life. And it's funny because I tell people in 2001, when I began that journey with Christ, really didn't know what I was doing. Just my heart was open to say yes that day. But it really stems from my brother, Chris, who is now a pastor and a PhD and a doctor and a Bible college president. I mean, he's doing amazing things. But in 1998 or 99, he began his journey with the Lord. And he's the first in our family to ever really have a serious relationship with Jesus. And we watched him for a couple of years, and we thought he was a little crazy. We thought he was nuts, potentially even being in some kind of crazy, cult or something at first. I really thought that because I grew up in a church that was not like that as far as, relationship with Jesus and accepting Christ as your Lord and Savior. That was not the kind of church I grew up in. I grew up in one that was very, kind of, you can go here and there every, once in a while. You make your first communion, you make your confirmation, but it's not, at least for me, I never heard about relationships. But that's what happened with my brother. And once we got past him, and his sort of new found faith, which miraculously changed him. I mean, he did a 180 and was completely renewed. Like he was going down a bad path and God got a hold of him. We saw the change in him. Sure. And seeing that change, it became attracted to me. And it wasn't that I wanted exactly what he had. I just wanted to love the way he was loving his wife and his son, his newborn son. I wanted to treat people the way he was treating people. And I didn't know what that was. But on Mother's Day, of all days, in 2001, my brother invited me and my mom to his church. And it was sort of like, hey, let's get the mom, let's celebrate her on her day. My wife actually wasn't even with me. She was with her mom that day, ironically. But I was 27 and I went to this church, and it was a different type of church. It was a Pentecostal church with a lot of charisma, shall we say, worship, bands, raising hands, singing. I mean, it's different than the church I grew up in. That part was a little weird for me still, the worship side of things. But when I heard the message that day, something in me just said, wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty awesome. And so my brother, when he asked me about that message, I said, I don't really even remember what he talked about, but it wasn't that bad. And my brother said, why don't you come with me? And I think he sensed that my heart was open that day. He brought me to the back bedroom of his house. He sat me down and he said, Jay, let me tell you about the gospel. Would you be interested in hearing about it? So he asked me, he didn't just force it upon me. And I said, yeah. I said, tell me. So he shared the gospel with me that day. He shared about salvation and who Jesus was and the depravity of man and the fact that we are sinners and that we are in need of a savior because we cannot save ourselves. And again, I didn't know what I said yes to that day. It didn't make 100% sense to me. It didn't comprehend completely, but my heart was open. Yeah. And then I said, yes. And so I tell people I accepted Christ that day. I said a sinner's prayer, but I really didn't know what I was saying. It took me, and it's still taking me 20 years to fully grasp that decision, but to understand the eternal implications that it had. And I told my brother this recently. I said, listen, if you don't share the gospel with me, there's no way I'm working at Sports Spectrum. There's no way that people are listening to me share other stories of other people's testimonies. There's no way, potentially that my wife doesn't become a Christian, that my daughter doesn't begin a journey with Jesus. It's all because I told my brother, it's all because of him having the guts, quite honestly, and the boldness to share with me about Jesus. Yeah. And the ripple effects that has going to generation, I pray for my daughter that she has kids that she can talk about Jesus to. You just don't know the ripple effects that's going to take place from the fact that my brother said, come here, Jay, I want to tell you about Jesus. And it's amazing. I spent about 20 years or so.
Well, and how cool is it to stand there at that spot 20 years later and be able to look back and go, oh, wow, God orchestrated every bit of this, even when it didn't make sense, that you can stand here now with that same boldness and go, yeah, this is the truth.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I think about that day quite a bit, especially now that it's 20 years, it's the 20th anniversary type of thing. And you look back whenever there's an anniversary around a specific moment for your life. And I look back now and it's funny, you don't know God's plan for your life often beforehand. If you told me 20 years ago that it was going to include leaving ESPN, I would have laughed at you. Right. But that's the plans. And now I see clearly what he was trying to do all of these years. And it all stems back to 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, then we go back to that moment that you have with Tony Dungy and his squad, and
Yeah.
what a jank that became in that same walk of faith. Is there a way for you to even just kind of quantify a little bit what changed for you in the workplace, and that who Jason became at that time to your coworkers?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there wasn't any real moments where I was sitting in a producer's chair in a control room and witnessing to people about Christ and, leading them to the Lord. There wasn't many moments like that, but there were a lot of moments where I felt like, I just wanted to be intentional about serving them, about being different too. I mean, you can serve and love people, but not compromise what you believe or who you are. And that's what I really tried to do. And people, now I can say people, when they saw that, have told me, yeah, Romano, you were who you were.
Yeah.
You weren't out partying and hanging out with us. You never really cursed. You were always try to be polite and kind. And listen, it's hard. You worked in the business,
Yeah.
There are many moments where politeness and kindness isn't prevalent. We'll say,
No.
it's a dog eat dog world. It's a cutthroat world, and it's a very competitive world. And so the competitor can come out, and there's not a whole lot of kindness and lovingness, if you will, in the business. But that's what I tried to do. It's how I tried to carry myself. It's how I tried to treat other people.
Yeah.
I always try to look at the bright side, look at the positive things. And, if that was a way for them to see something was different in me and open up an opportunity to share and talk about my faith, then that was great. And I had those moments too. I'll never forget the day I left ESPN. Mike and Mike is the show I worked on. And Mike Greenberg that day decided, and he didn't need to do this, to take about 90 seconds out of their show at the very end to say goodbye to me and honor me on the air.
To wrap it up for today, guys, please get a shot of Jason Romano for us on TV. So today is the last day, not only with us, but at ESPN, for someone who's been here just about as long as we have. Mm-hmm. He worked on our show 15 years ago and then came back in the last year to work with us as our social media director. Jason Romano, and the one thing I will say about him, of the many that you could, he is the one thing in life that we need more of. He is a genuinely nice person.
Yes, he is.
And he's done a great job for us.
He's a good guy. He's a good guy who's done a great job for us. He will be missed.
He is a person who has a great passion for sports, but he has an even greater passion for his faith, and he is following that
I'll tell you
his
what,
next professional endeavor.
Incredible person that can leave what he's done for so long because he feels he has another calling. So, Jason, tip of the cap to you. You've been a real asset to this company.
And I thought,
no doubt about it.
Okay, it's always nice when you hear people say nice things about you, but I never talked to Greeny about my faith. I never sat down and said, I'm leaving ESPN because I'm going into, ministry to work in sport. I never really sat down and talked to them about that. Yeah. But he addressed it on the air. So something clearly stood out that they saw. And I wasn't intentional about sitting down. Greeny, let's go to lunch and let's talk about faith. I didn't do that.
Right.
But they saw it. So that told me something that, okay, the way I was living out apparently reflected something to them that was positive.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I had I shouldn't say very similar, because my stuff was not on the air that way, but one of the guys that I had worked with, another camera operator that I had worked with for probably 15 years at that point, he knew that I was moving away, that I had taken a job at a church in South Carolina. So I was literally working my last gig with him, and we were kind of between things and just had some time to sit and talk, like we had several times. And he says to me, I want you to know something. I always knew where you stood. And I really appreciate that you never tried to, cram that down anybody's throat, but I always knew that you cared. And I had that same kind of thought of, wow, here I thought me just trying to be a good guy and not being abrasive when everybody else is. And I think there's just an element to live TV that, unless you've worked in that world, there's such a pressure to that just takes everybody to that pucker factor 12. And that people, I'm sure you've seen it time and time again, where people just kind of lose their minds when it seems like the show is unraveling, and everybody goes 0 to 60. And how how it's a different world to try to maintain your own sanity in those moments. I'm sure that I've got plenty of gray hair in here that is a result of that. But that was such an amazing moment for me. And I remember I was actually like, I need to kind of just step away here for a second, and just stepped outside and thanked God for a minute that, okay, God, I sometimes you don't know how people see you or receive you. And here's a guy who had next to no interest in faith as far as I could tell. And yet here's this moment that we had where it's like, okay, maybe I scratched the surface there, and somebody else could come along and share something with him at some point as well.
That is if the people you work with know that you care about them, they aren't going to care about what you believe or don't believe or whatever. They just know that you have their backs, that you care for their genuine best interest. And not only that, you care about them as an employee, but you care about them as a person. I had a lot of people in my life, especially at ESPN, who didn't care about Jason, the person. They cared about whether I could do the job well. And I get that. It's work. You want to do the job and you want to get it done. But when people who took an active interest in me, how is your family? How is your wife?
Yes.
That changed everything. That person was, okay, that person cared about me. I'm going to care about that person. I'm going to bat for that person.
Again, back to your Tony Dungy moment. There was, that his assistant said something to you along the idea of, maybe someday you're called away from here, but for now, Bloomer, you're planted. Obviously, at some point that happened. What did the shift away from ESPN and into Sports Spectrum where you are now? What did that transition? How did it kind of start and evolve?
Yeah, initially in 2008, 2009, 2010, my thought was that I needed to go to another place to be a Christian in the workplace. That's where that whole idea came from. And clearly I didn't need to do that. But I think even early in that time, God was planting very small seeds of maybe I might call you away someday. And I didn't think that would happen. That wasn't even top of mind, but it was planted. You could tell.
Yeah.
And around 2015, so this is 6 years now, right around this time in the summer of 2015, I was asked to speak at a Christian conference for social media producers, which is what my job was at that time.
Okay.
But I just happened to be a Christian who worked at ESPN. Everybody else at this conference was doing the same job I was doing, but they were there representing a church or a nonprofit or a faith-based company. So I go to this conference and I speak and I share a little bit about ESPN. And it's the first time I'd ever been asked to speak at a conference or anything like that, which is kind of funny because I've done a good handful of those now.
Sure.
And it all started then. But really, it was that day when I saw all of these people working what I would say is for a greater purpose in ministry, but doing the same job I could do, that I was doing.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder if maybe someday that's where God would call me to is to, what would that be like to work in ministry and take all the skills and the experiences that I had over the years and do it for something like this.
Yeah.
So that's really where the idea came from. And I remember sitting with a guy named Brad Lamanek, who's a friend of mine and an author and
I'm familiar with Brad.
Guru. You know Brad? Yeah, He's such a good dude. He knows everybody. He's the most connected person I know. That is one
very well-connected individual.
Yes, it is. So it's good to be friends with somebody like that. But Brad, a couple months later, came to ESPN because when we met at that conference, I told him, if you're in the Northeast, come and I'll give you a tour. He came and I gave him a tour of ESPN, showed him around, and we went to the cafeteria and we sat down and I told him that after that conference, God started really stirring in me the idea that maybe I was going to leave ESPN someday. I didn't know where, I didn't know how, but that maybe this was God saying, I need you to do more for me and I'm calling you away.
Yeah.
So Brad sits down to me, looks right at me and he says, Jason, you need to be careful. And I'm like, okay. He doesn't want me to leave. He goes, no. You need to be careful because if you leave ESPN, God's going to blow your mind. He's going to open up doors that you didn't even expect. And I just looked at him and I'm like, how is that possible? Because I work at the mecca of sports broadcasting. Yes. And this is 2015 that he tells me this, and I didn't leave until 2017. But over the next year and a half or so, I really made a point. First of all, the inkling from God to potentially leave continued to stay there. Like, it didn't disappear. But in 2016, I was working on Mike and Mike, and my hours were like 4 a.m. until 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, those morning show hours. So I got done with the show, and every single week in that spring and summer of 2016, I made a point to just see if I could connect with someone who was in the faith space, or, authors, writers, pastors, people who were Christians, who I could learn from and who I could listen to, and then tell them about the fact that I was feeling like God was calling me away to leave ESPN, just to see if I was nuts. I figured if I get 15 people on the phone and they all said I was nuts, then I probably shouldn't be leaving.
You draw the average.
But it was good. Right. And it was like, okay, let me see what they all say. And they all were really encouraging and not surprised, interestingly enough, which I was kind of caught off guard on. But that time was spent creating relationships that still exist to this day. And one of those relationships happens to be my boss of the company I now work for, Sports Spectrum. I had met Steve Stenstrom, who's my boss, on Twitter, and we DM'd each other. And I told him, can I just get 20 minutes on the phone with you? He said yes. And that's where I shared my heart. And I wasn't looking for a job. In fact, it didn't even comprehend that I was looking to, or that I was going to work with him someday. I was just trying to build a connection, right? And out of that, Steve says, well, we just purchased a company called Sports Spectrum. Are you familiar with it? I said, yes. He goes, it's a media ministry. It's sports and faith, and it's been around for 35 plus years. He's like, I can't think of anybody better to run this thing than you. Would you want to ever consider coming to this side? I'm like, Steve, I mean, it just happened that I called you. Well, he's like, why don't you do this? Pray about it. Come to one of our conferences, which was like December of 2016. And he's like, let's talk in person. So I flew down to Atlanta, or it was Florida that year, I think. And I met with him, and he presented to me this opportunity to really treat it like a startup. Like, we had just purchased Sports Spectrum. It had been around for 30 years, but let's treat it like it's brand new. And we'd love to have you come and, take all the knowledge that you have from ESPN and help build this thing up. But here was the key, Steve, and you'll appreciate this maybe. He said, I also want you to host a podcast and start a podcast and host it. And I said, okay, I think you have the wrong guy, because I've been producing for 20 years, but I haven't hosted anything since college. Right. Are you sure? He goes, Jason, you worked with Mike Greenberg and Stuart Scott and Bob Lee and Chris Berman and Jay Harris and these amazing interviewers. He's like, you know how to interview people. I think you'd be great at it. I said, okay, I'll try. He's speaking into me. And that's what I still do. 4 years later, I'm hosting this podcast, but it's grown to more, to a network of podcasts. I'm now the director of media for the team, and we've helped really build this, mini ministry, if you will, of shows. And the whole concept, though, is to bring Jesus into the conversation of sports. Yep. And to glorify him. That's completely different from ESPN. But everything else, I just take the skills that I have from ESPN, the editing skills, the booking skills, the producing skills, social media, and interviewing skills, I guess, of the people that I watch. And I just bring it into this frame of sports and faith. And that's what we're doing now. It's been 4.5 years, and I absolutely love what I get to do.
Well, and then again, from that same idea of being able to stand in one place and kind of look back at this row that you have been tending to for all these years, does it make sense now? I mean, you said that years back, if you had suggested any of this, it would have been completely laughable to you. But when you can look back and see how all those dots connect, I mean, what does that mean to you in the now?
It makes complete sense. but it still doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And I say that because that's who God is.
Yeah.
Like, God is a God who doesn't make sense sometimes, right? Like, he's God and we're not. And so that gives us that opportunity to look at him and say, okay, we're not in control here. He is.
Yeah. And
he'll blow your mind if you really put your faith and trust in him and take you to places that maybe you weren't planning on, but it's always for our good. Yeah. You know, he works all things together for our good to those that love him and are called according to his purpose. And it doesn't mean that you're going to get the dream job or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean what that scripture means, but it means when we place our faith and trust in him, that he's got our back and he's there with us. And that's why I say it makes complete sense because it's God, but it makes zero sense because it's not anything that I had ever planned.
Right.
You know, I didn't plan on being on your show and talking about 2 books and a podcast. If you'd talked to me 6 years ago, I would have laughed at you.
Right.
I would have, let's talk about ESPN. But yeah, he's done exceedingly and abundantly more than I could have ever imagined. So.
Well, I know we're not supposed to pick favorites, but does an interview or guest that you've had on Sports Spectrum just come right to the front of, I still can't believe that conversation happened with that depth and that rich or whatever? Who's that guy?
Well, the time I got to interview Darryl Strawberry, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's one thing to meet your hero. It's another thing to become friends, which is kind of crazy. But then when you actually get to interview him, and these are, you know, you have 30 minutes to ask your hero whatever you think you want to ask. And I really wanted to get into his testimony and his walk with the Lord. But I really wanted to ask him all of these questions about the Mets and the 86 team and all of the things that I watched as a kid. And I didn't ask that because I just didn't have the time. But then I realized, wait, this is not about the Mets anymore for Darryl. And that's why this conversation was so special. And so I got to interview him, and that was a pretty awesome thing. I will say there was a few interviews that I've done recently of people who are battling or going through physical ailments like cancer. He was a chaplain. His name is Mitch Mason. He's the chaplain of the North Carolina Tar Heels football team. And he's got a incurable disease that could kill him. It may not, but and he's not quite sure. It's a pathological thing. I don't know all the proper medical words for it, but he's in severe pain every day. And he's 45 or so, pretty young dude. Wow. He doesn't know if that'll ever go away or if it'll, what it'll kill him. I mean, they're doing the best to manage the pain, but it's this incurable disease, which is hard to think about. Like, it's 2021 and there are diseases out there that are not curable per se. There are cancers that are treatable and cancers that are not, but this is different. But when I talk to somebody like that and you sense joy and a love for God that comes out of that and a love for his family, those kind of conversations blow my mind, Steve, because I haven't been in that situation where I've been in severe pain or really felt the sting of cancer or any kind of thing. Like, I haven't been through that personally, and I haven't really had anybody close to me go through that. But to do that and still love God, it's that Job factor, right? In the book of Job, to have it all come crumbling at you and still loving God and trusting in him and finding joy in him. Those always blow my mind because I have joy in the Lord. I love Jesus, and I'm so grateful for what he's done in my life. But I've had very small, minimal trials when it comes to things like that. I mean, I had a tough situation with my dad and things like that growing up, but I don't know, maybe it's not right to compare, but when I see people going through what I feel like is way worse than anything I've ever gone through, but still walking through those valleys and knowing God is there, it just blows me away. It really does.
As one who spent more than a decade in live sports television, I really appreciate Jason's story, his dedication to his family, his work, and especially to God. I'm sure that there are a lot of people who might say that he was crazy for leaving that dream job, but I'm confident that you could hear the conviction in his voice. he knows that all of his prior experience was preparing him for what he is doing now. I asked Jason one last thing. How would you encourage someone who might feel frustrated or stuck where they are right now?
Wherever you are right now, bloom where you're planted. Like, I think about what Jessica said to me, and a lot of us are stuck in really bad situations. And some of it may be a financial situation. Some of it may be, a family member who's sick. Some of it may be just feeling kind of stuck. Understand that God has you where you are for a purpose, and to bloom and to be the light, to be the hands and feet of Jesus where you are, even if the situation is not the best one that you could imagine. And I just talking to Mitch, who I just mentioned, the chaplain, but even in my life, when I was in sort of these, little valleys of life, blooming where you're planted doesn't mean you have to, be woe is me about the situation you're in. It's really getting off your feet and going and serving others and loving others. And there's a real impact that can be made and a purpose for the pain that you're going through and that you're in. So I think as I close here, I think that's the one thing that comes to mind, Steve, is just to understand that, God has a true purpose for your life. And in the moment that you're in right now, it might be hard to see that, but you can be a light right where you are.
I've got links to Jason's books, website, and social media feed in the show notes. Make sure you check those out. And while you're there, you can also get connected on the Nook Facebook page. And you can also find my email address if you'd like to drop me a line. It's Stephen@nookpodcast.com. That's Stephen with a V at nookpodcast.com. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you here next time in the Nook. The Nook is a production of Sozo Digital Media.